This is our second makeup for our snow day, and we're going to look quickly at Rembrandt's etchings. We'll look at them quickly, but I'm going to show you quite a few of them because he's quite a prolific etcher. As you know from your OER readings, he made over 300 etchings through the course of his career, which is really quite a few. And he did some particularly extraordinary things in the field of etching. As much as I respect Rembrandt as a painter, we see him as a painter in his painting smock. On your right, although it's not really his painting smock, he's wearing a fur coat over the top of it to show off his status. This late self-portrait from a few years before he died, outside of London, with a palette and brushes and a paint stick to rest his hand on while he's painting. On the left, we see him drawing, maybe even etching, if you will, at an open window on the left. As much as I appreciate Rembrandt as a painter, I gotta say that his etchings are some of the best things ever printed when it comes to printmaking as a process. And so, what we'll do with this lecture is we'll first look at the process of etching, talk a little bit about etching as an artistic process, and then sort of move on to look at his prints. The way that you make an etching is you take a piece of metal, usually copper. You heat it slightly, and you add over the top of it a thin layer of a waxy varnish, sort of a softish varnish that covers the entire plate. And then you take a thin needle and you scratch through that plate, exposing the copper underneath. You then immerse it, as you see on your right, in a bed of fairly light acid that then will eat the plate where you've cut through the varnish. The varnish keeps the acid from biting the plate anywhere else. You use a feather, which you see in the picture on your right, to knock away any air bubbles that come up from the chemical interaction of the copper and the acid, and that allows the acid to continue biting. The longer you leave it in the acid bath, the deeper the lines will be cut. And Rembrandt was very good about pulling it out of the acid and stopping areas out and putting it back in again, doing what we call step etching, so that some lines are deeper than others. A few small differences in Rembrandt's day. They didn't use plastic tubs. What Rembrandt would have done was, around the edge of the copper plate, built up a little wall of wax and actually poured the acid directly on top of the plate, or he would have held it over some sort of a sink and poured the acid over the top of it. We think the well technique was what he most often used. After this, you would then clean the varnish off. After you've etched the plate, you would clean off this varnish layer that was protecting the white parts of the print, and it would then be printed. And what you would do to print it, as we see in this manual of how to print, made 1642, but actually printed in 1645. You see the inside of a printmaker shop. And what you would do is you would rub ink all over the plate, but particularly push it down inside of those engraved lines, those lines that were cut by the acid. You would then polish off the surface of the plate, all the flat areas, that would only leave the ink down embedded inside the lines. So the fellow in the background is taking a dauber and he's pushing ink into the lines. The fellow in the foreground on the left is wiping the plate clean. Abraham Bossa recommends even using a piece of bread to get some of the ink off. So he's using, in fact, the palm of his hand. You start off with rags, and you move to the palm of your hand to polish the plate clean. And as you did that, the ink stayed in those cut lines. You would then put it on a printing press, which you see on the right, and put some pads over the top of it. Put a piece of paper on the metal, put pads over the top of that, and then under extreme pressure, you crank it through this press, and you could see him hand and foot moving the rollers and cranking the print through. And then the ink that was down inside those individual lines would then be transferred to the paper. Paper's moistened, it helps the ink to transfer, and then laid out to dry, and you see this on the racks in the deep background of this print. So this is the etching process, right? And it allows the artist to make one plate, and from that one plate, print multiple impressions and market them much more broadly than you could market paintings, and to a different kind of clientele. There was, in fact, a budding market for these people who considered themselves to be print connoisseurs, people who only collected prints. But in addition to that, they were significantly cheaper than paintings as well, and so not only could they be distributed more widely, but they could be collected more readily. So as we look at Rembrandt throughout his entire career, he was interested in printmaking from his earliest days in Leiden. And his interest in prints really does seem to follow his interest in painting. He does quite a few printed self-portraits. And these early ones, when he's in Leiden, do the same thing that his paintings were doing in Leiden, which is he's trying to capture mood and emotion, characterization, things that he can use for his history paintings. Because remember, that's his major um, motivation, that's his major goal. And these are really quite small. These prints are. They're about not much bigger than postage stamps, really, when you see them. And I didn't put it down, but almost all of these prints, there's an impression at the Rijksmuseum. But there's also an impression of many of them also at the National Gallery. At the top of the self-portrait on the right, you can see that his hat just sort of cuts off, even though the edge of the plate is a bit higher. You can see where the plate embossed the paper at the very top. And that place where it sort of cuts off is probably where the wax wall was that kept the acid on the plate. But we can imagine him sort of looking into the mirror, making faces, and then capturing those quickly on these prints. I love these prints. I think they're just so good. But if you look at the top of his hat here, those sort of zigzag lines that he's using, or even sort of down here, the same sort of line quality, give it an amazing spontaneity. They look as if they were done extraordinarily quickly. In fact, early on, he's having trouble with the reversal process. He'll get his signature backwards sometimes. In this case, his signature is at the bottom down here. And it seems as if he's sort of awkwardly writing it, that the drawing is coming easier than the writing is for him. He poses members of his family. The names for these were given in the 1660s after Rembrandt's plates had come into possession of a print publisher. Remember that in 1656, Rembrandt had declared bankruptcy, and it seems as if that insolvency in the 50s had caused him sort of rippling economic problems, and he seems to have sold all of his plates to a print publisher to print copies of. And the print publisher's inventory lists these plates as being the artist's mother or the artist's father. And it may have been Rembrandt that sort of titled these in the first place, but we have no way of knowing for sure if they are. Nonetheless, these much more refined and finished prints also would have had a market over and above just being Rembrandt's parents, but he's posing them in costumes that he can then sort of manipulate when he makes paintings. And there's not a one-to-one connection between prints and paintings. There are definitely similarities. You can certainly see how the print of the artist's mother looking to our right is very, very similar to the Hannah picture on your right, but not a direct quote, not like it's a study for it or anything. He's just interested in treating the same themes. Here we see a man in a furry turban on your left, and is that the same man in oriental dress on your right? They're from the same year. It's altogether possible, but again, this shows us that what Rembrandt's doing in prints is exactly what he was doing in paintings, is he's making these tronies, these headshots, that are costume studies and studies of expression for figures that can then be reapplied into religious or historical pictures, never on a one-to-one basis, but usually with some inventiveness. Many of the same models he's using for both prints and for paintings. I think this is pretty much the same guy. posing as Jeremiah, lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. And on the left, simply etched study of an old man with a flowing beard. So there is really quite a bit of continuity between Rembrandt's prints and his paintings. He's using the same models for many of them, and sometimes there seems to be even a closer continuity. Here, for example, we already looked at Simeon's Song of Praise when we talked about his paintings on the right, but on the left we see the exact same theme. This is where Christ is brought to the temple. Simeon, the blind priest, remember, sings a song of praise because he has now seen the Lord. Medieval tradition had made him blind and miraculously given sight by Christ, and singing a song of praise for that miracle. Here with the painting, the light coming down Caravaggio-like from somewhere off stage. Well, the print, in a much more intimate fashion, allows him to sort of retreat the same themes. The same standing figure, Simeon cradling Christ in his arms, the Virgin Mary now with her back to us, watching the circumcision take place, right? This is what's going to happen as he's presented in the temple. He's going to move on to the circumcision. The figure's huddled around, and then opening up in the background here to the sort of deeper architectural setting for the entire scene. They're not the same composition. It is the same historical moment or narrative moment, but handled in similar but different ways. And Prince, I think, allowed Rembrandt to explore and re-explore themes that he was interested in. I love this one from roughly the same time. And again, exactly the same scene. Christ has been brought to the temple. And the moment after the presentation, of course, Simeon will circumcise Christ. And this is just great. Here's little baby Jesus, and a Catholic picture. You would never see Christ as a bawling baby, but here he is. He's getting cut, and he's feeling the pain. And there's Simeon, right? Or the moil, actually. Simeon's holding him, the moil coming in to perform the circumcision, and Jesus, in a very, very human way, screaming his little eyes out. When we looked at his paintings, we looked at Tobit and Anna, a theme that interested Rembrandt through his entire life. Blind Tobit, you remember, couldn't work anymore. Part of the Apocrypha, part of the Catholic Old Testament, but not recognized by the Protestants. And on the left, we see Rembrandt also exploring this theme at the same time, or roughly the same time, in these early, very, very sketchy etchings. Here's Tobit, here's his son Tobias coming back, and as the story tells us, he goes to the door when he hears the sound of Tobias coming back. I think the dog has come back through the door as well. Rembrandt isolates the figure again, doesn't give us any of that. And we see Tobit blind, he's reaching out, making sure that he doesn't go crashing into the wall as he reaches toward that door. You'll notice behind Tobit's head that a lot of the plate is scratchy and rough, and there are lines running through it that seem to have nothing to do with the composition. Look at this area right up in here, and you can see a bunch of upper left to lower right vertical lines there. Or if you look behind his head here, there are lines that seem somewhat random, and up in the corner here there are pit marks. All of these things are sort of happy errors. They're sort of mistakes. He didn't polish the plate completely. He may have used the plate for something else and then decided to reuse it for this. Or the acid may have gotten through the varnish in areas he didn't expect. And he doesn't seem to care. That becomes part of the Rembrandt aesthetic. In the same way, at the end of his life, the messiness of his paint becomes part of his aesthetic. Tobit continues to fascinate Rembrandt. I later print, 20 plus years later, we see again the same scene. Tobit has heard the dog, and you see the dog now has come through at his feet, and he's going for the door. And in this case, he is going to crash into the door, right? He's reaching for it, and he's about to bump into that wall. because the door is off to his right. He's not going to make it through. Prince allowed him to readdress thematic concerns, and I think, as we've seen in a lot of Rembrandt pictures, they allow him also, I think, to show his extraordinary sense of humor that he has in many of his works. He also becomes very much interested, just as he was doing face studies for biblical scenes. He also becomes very interested in documenting the world around him, and in particular, he seems, particularly in the late 20s, early 30s, particularly interested in images of the poor and the homeless that were around him, both in Leiden and in Amsterdam. And they're, again, incredibly lively, incredibly spontaneous. There's almost a sense that he's maybe even carrying some of these plates around with him outside and sketching when he sees things. The norm for printmaking was to make sketches in pen and then simply transfer those sketches to the plate. But that would suggest that the sketch leads to a much more finished, polished composition. And Rembrandt's have a spontaneity in life. The back foot of our beggar on the right, and you can see how he sort of roughed it out as a sort of C shape, and then he sort of came back in and added a heel to it. But he's left the traces of his wandering explorations there for us to see. Um, I love how he seems to be doing more than just using an etching needle with the ones on your right. If you look, for example, at his hat, you can see these big, broad areas of black that look like he's maybe even using a quill pen of some sort, a nibbed pen to draw through the ink, something certainly thicker than the pinpoint of an etching needle. If you look at the beggar man and woman on your left, and you see how many times the line just sort of wanders and grabs it and then comes back and reiterates it, and he leaves these elements. Look at this great shoe down here. And again, it doesn't really coalesce as a shoe, but he's going back and he's sort of wandering around the line, he's finding it, and he's leaving us this sort of wonderful view of how he got there, right? How did he actually make the print? He sees these as finished compositions. He wouldn't sign them if he didn't. Many of these beggar images also seem to have a very direct relationship to some of his other compositions, where they're filling his mind with this visual repertoire of figures that he can use and reuse in different compositions. So here is Joseph Mary fleeing Israel, Jerusalem, or Bethlehem, that is, for Egypt when they've heard inadvertently from the Magi that Herod plans to kill all the 2-year-olds. They heard from an angel. The Magi led on to Herod that the Savior had been born, and he decides to kill all the 2-year-old kids. And Joseph and Mary decide to take off to Egypt for sanctuary. And so here we see them on the flight into Egypt, and you can see that the pose of old Joseph leading the donkey is very much derived from the pose of the peasant woman on your right, and even the head and the shawl of the Virgin Mary cradling the head of Christ in her arms seems to have some background in these beggar images. They're a fascinating study because in some of these images, Rembrandt is really quite rude, ribald, grotesque. A pair of images, certainly meant as a pair, of a man urinating and a woman urinating. Certainly scenes that are not the normal stuff of high art, and they're not given any kind of narrative context. They're certainly not meant to be a comment on anything, but rather they are just images of everyday life in all of its grotesqueness. I should mention that the woman making water is doing more than making water, as you can see. She's also, I guess, making earth, if you will. And you can almost think that Rembrandt is mocking them. But what's kind of fascinating is that there seems to be within these a sort of sense that he's recording these images of beggars because he understands that but for the grace of God, so there I could be. That the beggars show us not only our own social duty to give alms to the poor, to take of our profit, of our success, and give some of that back to those who have been less fortunate than ourselves, but also that there's not that much that separates us from them. And Rembrandt really gives us that exact idea with this wonderful bearded beggar on the bank on the right. Seems very similar to the couple on the left emerging from behind a bank of earth, but it's Rembrandt's self-portrait. And again, rendered just as fast as he can, it seems, with lines that are just these curious and glorious zigzags that you see that give it this sense of almost like expressionism, or just impressionism, as if it was something that was done on the fly, on the spur of the moment. Well, in 1631, he moves to Amsterdam, and we've talked before about the fact that Rembrandt seems to have been a man of ambition. He really does have his aims set very, very high. And this self-portrait from the year that he moves to Amsterdam, I think, reflects that ambitious young painter that Rembrandt was, moving from the small town of Leiden, where he imagines himself as a beggar, to the big city of Amsterdam to make his place as an artist. You'll notice the difference in how he handles the line in this image, the sort of loose sketchiness that we see in the bearded beggar has turned into a more refined, more regularized hatching, particularly in that sleeve in the foreground, but even in the background as well. And this is, I think, in many ways intended as a presentation piece, and you can see quite clearly the degree to which he can etch some of the lines darker and more deeply, and leave some of the lines just etched ever so slightly. In other words, some of them were in the acid longer than others were, and Rembrandt has masterfully put it in for a few minutes, brought it out, stopped out areas, put it back in, brought it out, stopped out more areas, put it back in, to present a very painterly rather than a draftsmanly use of etching, something that's emulating painting rather than looking like a page from a sketchbook. And in Amsterdam, Rembrandt does begin to investigate the connection between prints and paintings, and he begins to make a few prints that seem to be directly connected to paintings. So we had talked about this really important commission from Frederick Hendrick for a series of passion images. And we had focused more on the raising of the cross, but here's the descent from the cross. Part of that suite of pictures that was commissioned by the state holder, Frederick Hendrick, Prince Frederick Hendrick, for his palace in The Hague. And Rembrandt treats it in a very realistic fashion. You can see the blood on the cross where his crown of thorns and his hands were, lowered into the arms of his followers with that sort of body type that's very unidealized and typical for Rembrandt. On the left, a very, very large etching where he has absolutely reproduced it, only in reverse because of the printing process, right? He drew it on the plate the right way forward, and then as it printed, it got reversed, and he didn't bother to account for that. He was probably inspired by Rubens in Flanders, the most famous artist alive at the time, who had had a number of reproductive prints made after his painted compositions. But for Rembrandt, this is very rare, that there's such a one-to-one connection between his prints and his paintings. The reproductive work, this seems to be really maybe even the only one that I know of for sure. Other ones try to be painterly. They try to get the tonal range and the drama of paintings, and some of them are really quite large. This is really quite a big print, all points considered, a good 8 or 10 inches tall. And it's retreating a theme that he had done in painting as well at exactly the same time, and it allows him again to re-envision it. Right? So in both of them, we have Lazarus raising out of the grave, and we can see, if we imagine the print on the left being reversed, that Lazarus is in the same position. We have the same wonder-struck people with gestures denoting it, and you can see that the sort of relationship between this group here, right, is in fact really similar in both of the images. But what's changed is that he's now giving us Christ from the other side. Both of them, he's standing on the stone of the tomb that's been pushed away. But instead of seeing Christ from the front, we see him from the back. We participate as a viewer in the same way that the people that we see do. We look past Christ to see the miracle that he's wrought. Other prints are not related to any painted version. There's no sort of painting that these rework the ideas of, but in each of them, and again, these are very large plates, Rembrandt is using printmaking to make sort of a painterly kind of print. With the angel appearing to the shepherds on the right, one of the things that we see that will fascinate Rembrandt through his entire career is this attempt to create a very, very dark kind of image, a sense of printed tone, and being able to use that tone to, in this sort of Caravaggio fashion. Here, the light of heaven opening up as the angel, upper left corner, appears to the shepherds to tell them that Christ has been born, and how Rembrandt has captured the fall of light on the shepherds, the shadows that they cast, as it comes out of heaven in the upper left. But that the rest of the print is more or less cast in the shadow. The Death of the Virgin on your left, another very, very large print, also has that same range, sort of silky range of tones down below, from the very, very light that falls on the face of the Virgin to the darker figure reading the book in the foreground, or that chair in the lower right foreground with a figure looking in through the curtains on the right. But then as the angels come to take the Virgin's soul away to heaven at the end of her life, you can see that heaven up above here is rendered in a sketchy manner, where he's exploiting what prints can do and paintings cannot. So we think that with a lot of these early prints, one of the things that Rembrandt is trying to do is to sort of position himself as a printmaker and say, not only can my prints do what paintings can, but my prints can actually be better than paintings in some way, that they can do some of the things that paintings can, but then they can do things that paintings simply cannot, like what we see happening in this sort of cacophony of lines in the upper left corner. So in these, really, Rembrandt is beginning to exploit what printmaking can do. We also see as he does this that he'll do different variations of the same scene on different plates, but then he'll treat it extraordinarily differently. So here are two images of the Adoration of the Shepherds from the same year. And you can see that the one on the left is worked up rather quickly. The outlines of the figures or I should say the shadows on the figures are just a series of diagonal lines. They don't even overlap with each other. And then it gets lighter around Mary and Christ in the center. But we see the shepherds leaning in from the left. One of them even has a little boy with him. And there's that wonderful bit of candlelight in the background here, right, that illuminates the entire scene. On the right, the exact same scene, but handled with this quest for tone, where not only has Rembrandt etched the entire thing darker with a much stronger and deeper lattice work of lines, but in addition to that, Rembrandt's doing something that we'll see him do a lot, and that is that he's leaving a lot of excess ink on the plate. As I mentioned, what you do with an etching is that you rub ink into the lines and then you polish off the flat parts. But Rembrandt realized somewhere around the late 40s that each impression of a print could have its own identity, could be unique almost in its appearance, if he would in fact selectively wipe the plate and leave layers of ink on top of it where there are no etched lines. And so with the Adoration of the Shepherds on the right, what he's done is he's wiped some areas spot clean, and other areas he's left a lot of surface ink. So we get the faces of these two fellows here, obviously the lamp. Little area down over here where Christ is, these have been wiped cleaner than the rest of it. And it gives it this extraordinary sense of being at night, where, like at night, if you look at it long enough, figures will emerge from the darkness as your eye gets accustomed to the light. Looking through all of Rembrandt's prints, we see he's just an extraordinary master of exploiting different kinds of effects. So on the left, this is after Christ's resurrection. He comes back and he appears to the apostles. It's right around the time of the doubting Thomas scene. And what he's done is he's only etched it ever so lightly. Right? There's not much in the way of cross-hatching. There's not much in the way of darkness here. And the whole point is that this is Christ coming from heaven. He's exploding with light into the room, and it's the light of Christ that illuminates everything around him and almost obliterates any shadows. It's like being in a spotlight of sorts. On the right, the entombment is rendered very differently, very, very dark, and again with surface tone, that he's come back and individually wiped areas cleaner than others, but leaving a lot of ink, a thin film of ink, over the surface of the plate that adds to the overall mood. And again, this is just utter mastery of the medium, to come back in and wipe with your fingers the arms and the head of this fellow, or this one, or the area around the body of Christ, in order to draw our eye to it. To give you a sense of the way in which he could wipe each plate separately, one of the things that we see with this, here are two different impressions of the same plate. Two different proofs, if you will, drawn from the exact same plate. And you can see how some of them have been wiped very different than others. The one on the right, these are both in the National Gallery, by the way, but there are impressions in the Rijksmuseum as well. And what we see, of course, is that he's left a lot more of that plate tone on the one on the left, and almost wiped no single part of it clean at all. At the same time that he's doing this, he's also beginning to experiment with different kinds of paper as well. There had been a huge import of paper from Japan. Rembrandt buys a huge stock of that to print from. He also gets packing paper, oatmeal packing paper that he uses. He even begins to print on calf skin, on vellum, which was normally used for manuscript illumination, just to see what sort of different pictorial effects he can get. All of this goes hand in hand with the ways in which he's wiping his plates, that he's trying to achieve pictorial form and really exploit printmaking for all that it can do. With this in mind, another thing that Rembrandt does is he'll work the image through a series of what are called states. He'll scrape in the initial design, and then he'll come back and change it. He'll do the initial design. He'll run a number of proofs, and then he'll put it back under a new coat of varnish and cut back into it again. So if we look, this is this particular print, Christ Presented to People, is worked through I think 8 or 9 different states, and each one of them adds a little something to it. So here's Christ on the podium being presented by King Herod to the people, where they say, "Give us, I'll set one of these people free. Behold the man." And the people ask for Barabbas instead of Christ. And we see that Rembrandt has focused on that throng of people in the foreground. And again, they're all rendered so wonderfully, so full of character. This is that repertoire of figures that Rembrandt has built up in his mind. And there's Jesus on top, being presented by Herod in chains before the crucifixion. And what you can see if you look closely is, and this is what print connoisseurs would do, is the area here in state 3 has been altered here, where he's added more shading to the top of that archway on the right. He's cleaned it up a little bit, added more detail. And you can see that he's even added more of that column capital in that particular area. So he's made some changes to the composition. Up above here, you see more lines that have been scratched into the plate. Rembrandt seems to have produced a significant number of impressions of each of the states. And we think that he's playing the market, that print connoisseurs, that collectors, would have wanted to collect the entire run. But at the same time, he's this restless attacking of the plate, hoping to find parts of the composition that he didn't work through entirely the very first time. With this particular plate and another that we'll look at, you can see that long about state 8, he really went drastic on this, and he went and he scraped out all of the figures in the foreground, and he replaced them with the dungeon down below, removing that entirely, and then adding a few other things. Right, he's changed the window in the upper right corner, for example. Right, that original arched window has been kicked down a ways. He's even signed it there above that doorway, and it added a lot more darkness and a lot more detail to that corner of the composition there. We think part of the reason he did this is, again, to play the market, to inspire people to buy more impressions of his works, but also prints on copper being run through that high-pressure press have a shelf life. The longer you run it through the press, each time the line becomes less distinct. When it has good sharp edges, it holds a fair amount of ink, but each time those edges wear out a little bit. And what we think is that Rembrandt realized that the plate was wearing out. And instead of just re-hitting those lines and giving a sort of secondary version of the original idea, he went ahead and he totally reworked it instead, so that the buyer would have a fresh kind of print, brand new, that had all the freshness of the original states of the image. Here, another work that he's redoing again and again, the Three Crosses. Both of these are state 1 of at least 6, I think, where Christ is on the cross, and he's focusing on the fall of light from God up above on Christ and the thieves and the throng of people around them that include the Virgin Mary. There's a figure on his knees worshiping, figures moving off into the landscape. Your eye sort of wanders into these shadows and picks out the different figures. You can even see to our right from Christ, on his left, mourner with his hands on the side of his head, and at his feet the Virgin Mary huddled down with more of Christ's followers. This one and the Ecce Homo that we just saw before were done entirely in dry point. This is a different printmaking technique. I think you might have read about it, where instead of using the resin cover and acid to bite the lines, you simply scratch at the plate with your etching needle, which kicks up a little furrow on the plate. So you drag it through the copper with a steel needle, and you get the grooves that the acid would have made. But in addition to this, the metal that was in that groove stays on the plate. It sort of kicks off to the right, like imagine if you were plowing a field and the dirt would kick off to the right. Well, that's what happens with a dry point. And it holds more ink, and it gets really thick and sort of inky. I don't know if I can say that or not. But this figure here, for example, is holding a lot of dry point ink in each of these. You can see it here. This sort of soft, heavily inked area here is that dry point burr. That's what we call it, grabbing so very much of that ink. And in this particular case, he's also experimenting with different printmaking papers, with Japanese paper, with oatmeal paper. The one on the right, which is an impression that's in Paris, is on lambskin. It's on vellum. And he's, again, totally interested in these sort of painterly effects, but also exploiting what printmaking can do that painting simply can't. And all of these sort of proclaiming these prints as sort of unique, special images that a collector would want to buy all of. Again, as the dry point burr wore down, Rembrandt totally reworked the plate. So in states 1 through 3, it follows the composition you see on your left. In state 4, he went back in and he burnished out the lines. He flattened out the plate again and recarved it with more dry point, giving us some diagonal lines in the foreground, removing figures altogether. The two figures walking off have been burnished out. The horses changed direction. The figures around Christ, between Christ and the thief on your left have been totally changed. One of them sort of looks like a stormtrooper from Star Wars. And the lights, the lines of light coming down from heaven have been made much, much more vertical. And it really does end up changing sort of the way in which we view the picture. The earlier one on the left is really very much about humanity reacting to the death of Christ. And the one on the right is about the light of heaven shining on Christ. It sort of almost changes the theme as he's made these late state changes. Now, we will wrap up Rembrandt by looking at one last group of prints. First, remember that in 1642 Saskia died, and he did etchings of Saskia sick in bed as well. Here is a etching plate that he treated almost like a sketchbook. 2 different beggar studies, maybe 3 different beggar studies, lower left, above that, and then flip the plate 90 degrees and now in our upper right. And you can also see that we have 3 different studies of Saskia, one very lightly etched, just her face, and then 2 of them with her sick in bed. At the same time that Saskia is getting sick, right around the same time she dies, actually, Rembrandt begins to do landscape painting. And I don't know if there's an A to B connection between these things, but it's sort of romantic in a way to think about Rembrandt sort of seeking solace by studying nature as his wife is being slowly killed by disease. His greatest period of printmaking came in the 1640s, came after the death of Saskia, and lasted pretty much for about 10 years after that. And it's kind of interesting to think of Rembrandt sort of wandering around, lamenting the death or the sickness of his wife in these prints. But they're absolutely wonderful in capturing not only a sense of atmosphere, even though you'll see on the left there's absolutely nothing in the sky, but there still is a sense of atmosphere to it, but also a sense of space. The regression back into space is extraordinary. Excuse me, and all of these mundane details of the world around him. In both of these, you'll notice the prominence of the mill. Rembrandt's father, you might remember, operated a mill, and windmills, may have had a very personal resonance for Rembrandt, but we really shouldn't think of that because he's working for a market. He's trying to sell these things, and windmills would have had a resonance for anybody who bought these prints as well, because they were in fact, important to all Dutchmen. In addition to grinding grain, windmills also operated pumps that helped the Dutch to build dikes and move the water from one side of the dike out to the ocean and reclaim dry land back from the sea. So they're metaphors in many ways for the country itself, not only newly independent from Spain, but also incorporating increasing amounts of dry land into its territory. The windmill was how that was achieved, and was one of the great points of pride for the Dutch. Popular poems talk about doing what Rembrandt seems to be doing here, which is going out and wandering around the countryside and marveling at what you see, not only the ingenious manipulation of the land by the Dutch, but also the handiwork of God as revealed in the landscape. With the windmill print on your left, you can see how certain parts of the print, for example, the lower left corner, are very deeply etched, very, very dark, sort of stark lines, and how other areas are, in fact, very, very lightly etched. These 2 figures wandering along the dike, along what the Dutch call the polders, and looking at the landscape. There are surrogates. And this is exactly what the Dutch poetry of the 17th century said, was go out and wander the landscape, go out and wander the dikes, and look at the trees, and look at God's handiwork, and remember that. Right? Other wonderful details, just how does that line work as part of the landscape? Because when you see it up front, they just become these sort of jagged, rambling squiggles and whatnot. And yet, for somehow, in Rembrandt's hand, they become a very viable part of the landscape. We also see in this detail Rembrandt's step etching, right? So I started off talking about how deeply etched the lines were on the left. And the lines on the right here, especially as we move off into the deeper distance, you see a small house back there, for example. Maybe even some smoke rising from a cottage that these figures are looking off into the deep distance at. Those lines are very, very slightly etched. They spent much less time under the acid than the left-hand side of the print. So it's a marvel of step etching. Etching it in different steps by stopping out areas as you move through the process. There's such an immediacy to Rembrandt's landscape prints that it's very easy to think that they were done on the fly, that he was out there sketching these in the landscape, and there's nothing really to prove that. It's a possibility, but he may have just been making sketches, and those sketches may have provided him with the same sort of mental repertoire of landscape motifs that he could then easily execute back in the studio. Our image on the left shows an artist sketching the landscape. There we see a little Dutchman drawing from the cottage. It's almost as if that's Rembrandt himself, although it doesn't look like him. Sketching the same cottage that Rembrandt is sketching on his etching plate. With the image on your right, Six's Bridge, this was commissioned, was not commissioned, it was named after one of Rembrandt's friends, Jan Six. And the story grew up that because of it being so slightly etched, so simply composed, that Rembrandt had done it on a dare, that he had been having lunch with Jan Six, and he had been challenged by Jan Six to make a print in the shortest time possible, in the same amount of time it would take Jan Six's servant, the same time it would take him to go out and get a pot of mustard. Rembrandt would try to do a print as fast as that. And he did. At least that's the legend, right? Of course, there's no truth in this because he didn't have his etching press, and he didn't have his chemicals with him. But nonetheless, there's this idea that these prints could be just something that you could do in, 15 minutes or less because of how he just lightly dabbles in elements, right, that simply look like just the most simple kind of squiggles that then function as part of the landscape. I'm jealous of his ability. Look at that tree. His ability to render things that look like what they're supposed to look like, but are done in just this extraordinary brevity of technique. I only have a few more prints to show you. One of them is this extraordinary panorama looking toward Haarlem. We can see Haarlem off in the distance on the left, in the deep distance, and in the foreground we see the area around Haarlem with the fields, and there's a country estate, and there are figures working the fields, and I think I have some details to show you. This was, again, misnamed the Goldweyer's Field. We know whose field it was. It belonged to a man named Christoffel Thees, and this is his country estate called Saxenburg. And we can see people out working the fields around his country estate. These are probably people that worked for Christoffel Thees. Because it seems to be a portrait of someone's land holdings, we think it was commissioned. It's a fairly large landscape as well. But others have suggested that perhaps Rembrandt made it to pay off a debt to Christoffel Thees. Remember that in the 40s and 50s, Rembrandt's financial success was on the wane, and he was not really doing so well. This also shows, this print, Rembrandt's ongoing use of dry point, which we talked about when we looked at those late religious prints. And you can see the lines that were etched versus the lines that were dry point. So let's look at this area right through here, right? The bit in the middle here, that's all etched line, right? But these parts over here, these fuzzier lines, that's all the result of dry point. And you can see what Rembrandt has done, and has become very, very good at, is using dry point to sort of lock in space, to allow your eye to move back through. And those big sort of splotchy, the areas that look like they're the ink has sort of bled, right? Here, 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 right? That's all dry point back in here. And that fuzziness, that shadowiness that you capture, Rembrandt has become an absolute master at sort of controlling and using it to lock everything into space. And that's one of the things he's absolutely terrific at. Our last landscape print that we'll look at in any depth is the Three Trees, one of his most famous landscape etchings. And here he seems to be focusing on not only the landscape, and just like the one on your left, we have a city back on the left, seen in the deep distance. But we're here out in the countryside, unprotected, if you will. And there's this storm that it has either just passed or is gathering. I like to think it's just passed. And how he renders the storm in multiple ways. Upper right corner, the lines are more loose. Toward the left, the lines become more tight. It almost begins to look like clothing or something. And some people have suggested that Rembrandt took a print he had started to work with another composition and changed it around to become a landscape. Maybe something like the Death of the Virgin. And then he scratches right over the top of it with those extraordinary lines that he's made with a ruler to give you the sense of the bolts of rain coming down from this swirling stormy sky. Here's a nice detail of some of those lines. And you can see as you look at areas such as here, now there's a sense that it might have been something else to begin with. And that Rembrandt has then turned it around from an angel in heaven, something along those lines, into now a stormy sky, right? And come over with some dry point lines and scratched right into the surface, just tearing it up to give you this sense of the violence of this storm. You can even see above the Three Trees the birds sort of flitting around in the crosswinds generated by this extraordinary storm. The focus is on these three trees on a hill, and one of the things that we find out from reading Dutch poetry of the era is that the landscape was part of looking at the landscape and going out and wandering around was to see God's handiwork and to see God reflected in the landscape. And when one sees three trees on a hill, from a symbolic Christian perspective, it's very easy to think about these three trees as being referenced back to the three crosses on the Mount of Calvary. And in that way, seeing God in the landscape. It's chock-a-block full of extraordinary detail that make it worthwhile looking at. Again, Rembrandt leaves plate tone and spot polishes areas, but everything from rendering the fisherman with his wife in the foreground, the herder with the cattle behind him, the city back in the distance, and again that windmill with just the briefest of distinction. You'll notice that you almost like you got the preparatory line for the horizon that he got rid of later, but he didn't get rid of it. He just left it there anyway. Rembrandt is kind of a sloppy printmaker in a way, and in a way that's really extraordinarily charming, right? And the more you look, there's more and more to see. These wonderful cows that he gets with just these simple measures, and again, people, right, doing exactly what the poetry says. Wander along the polders, wander along the dikes, look at the world around you, and imagine the handiwork of God. Here we see what I imagine to be intercity transport, their idea of the metro, if you will, a cart full of people moving from one town to the next, another figure with a large walking stick moving along the same path. The idea that life goes on despite this storm that is passed on. And there's a little artist looking off to the sunny horizon, turning his back on the storm. I think this is Rembrandt. I think this is how he felt at this time. His life has been pretty crappy right around this time. 1642, his wife had died. He's beginning to see his financial success turn sour. And if we think about it, right now he's turning his back on all of that. He's turning his back on the storm, and he's looking toward what he hopes to be a brighter horizon. He's met Gertke Dirks, and they're beginning their relationship with Titus's nursemaid that he's hired after Saskia's death, and that might be something that enters into this sort of personal symbolism of the landscape. And if we keep in mind that relationship, there's something else that's really fascinating going on. If we look into the deepest shadow here, and again, Rembrandt's inviting us to look and look deeply. Can you see them there? There's a couple snuggling, kissing in the shadow, and I highlighted them, so this should make it a little bit more clear, right? Let's go back now. Right there they are, and you can see her in profile, him leaning in. They're canoodling in the bushes here. This is something that Rembrandt does more than once. In this print from just 2 years later, another etching, we also see a couple canoodling in the bushes. And again, we have to dive in closely to find them underneath all the shadow, but there they are again. Now, if we think about what's going on in Rembrandt's life at this time, and the fact that he's now taken up with Gertrude Dirks, but he cannot, in fact, marry her, that he's living under clouds of suspicion at the time, and hiding what he's doing, it's very easy to look at these images and sort of make some connection to what's going on in Rembrandt's life. So what we've seen with Rembrandt's prints is, I think they're really extraordinary, and some of them have a direct connection to what he's doing in painting. Some of them have absolutely none. He did so few landscape paintings in his lifetime. We'll see one in the Rijksmuseum, but there are only like 7 all told out of about 300 paintings, whereas he did dozens and dozens and dozens of landscape prints. Right? He sees printmaking as another outlet that allows him to do things sometimes that are similar to his paintings. That's particularly true early on, but also allows him to take on themes, rework them in new ideas, but then to do things that are unique to printmaking, to exploit elements of etching as a medium that no one else had really ever exploited before. And I think that's what makes these absolutely